What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and today we are back for another episode of the Platform Fighter and Super Smash Brothers tutorial series. So in this episode we are going to be going over more item physics. We're basically going to wrap up a lot of the functionality for throws and drops of weapons. So we're going to be able to hold the weapon the same way and the correct way every time. Before, when I was picking up weapons, they would be attached at different rotations and they could look weird or funny. We're going to make sure they're always in the right orientation now, at the right spot on our socket. We're going to make sure whenever we throw it, it always launches, it always rotates, and goes until it hits an opponent. Before, we had several bugs, several issues just for things that we haven't covered yet, where it could collide with another object and stop. It could refuse to stop rotating when it was picked up or when it collided with an enemy or another object. And we also had a point where we could just never throw objects in our game, depending on a race condition that we actually had. And so now we're going to fix all those up. We're going to have perfect throws every single time, left and right. Give you an example of one to the left as well, without all those ones on the screen. So I'm going to be able to throw it, and there we go. So you can see I have left and right rotations. I can throw them either direction. They both work. They work no matter how many I have. They're not overlapping with each other and stopping each other from launching. Our actual rotation looks a little bit smoother. So we're doing a lot of changes today, a lot of quality life with our throws, and our drops will work basically the same. But they're going to always update to be upright instead of just going wherever or staying in place like they sometimes were as well. So everything is going to always make sure it returns to its upright position, which is what we want. When we get gravity involved, obviously dropping it will allow it to fall to the ground or the one-way platform. And throwing it, when we throw it, it will collide with, a character or a wall, bounce back, and then go and hit the ground. That's another thing we need gravity for, and bouncing is a separate mechanic we haven't covered yet. And we also still need up and down throws. I'm going to cover them slightly differently. We could actually do them now. There's nothing against doing them now with what we have, but I want to do some additional logic. I want to have gravity working before we do that stuff. That way I can show you throwing it up and it coming back down, and also the differences it has with when you throw it down, the velocity it comes down with, and how gravity plays into that. So basically, our system is going to be a lot more functional after today. After today, it'll actually be where you can use it, throw them, and hit your opponent and continuously do damage to them. It's not as flashy as games like Super Smash Brothers yet, but functionally it's pretty close to being as accurate as you would expect at this point without gravity, bounciness, and being able to throw up or down. The rest of it should work as expected. So we're going to clean all this up. I'm excited for this today. Episode I've been waiting on because I really do like the item physics. There's just a lot to it, so it's hard to cover everything at one time. If you'd like to get caught up in the series before we get started, I'll leave this playlist in the top right corner right here. You can check out everything we've done to get to this point, as well as anything that new that gets added to the playlist after this point. It'll be in there in this iCard. You can see everything we do. Alternatively, you can click this episode right here. If you're just interested in item physics, this will be our first episode where we introduced items, and then you can follow along with everything we've done with them so far. Otherwise, let's get started. You'll also notice that we are in Unreal Engine 5 today. So I did have a video a few episodes back where I showed you how to convert each project, each series that we have to Unreal Engine 5. And so that still applies. I was actually episodes ahead, which is why you still saw episodes past that point in Unreal 4. So don't be confused. Everything you saw in those episodes works in both Unreal Engine 4 and Unreal Engine 5. No other changes needed. But just so you know, from this point forward, we are going to be using Unreal Engine 5 in the series. You're more than welcome to keep using 4. If issues come up, I will do my best to fix them between one version and the other. But at this point, we will be using Unreal Engine 5. Alright, so let's get started today by fixing a bug that we have in our system. A lot of today's changes are quality of life updates and just things to make, logic function better than it did. Not necessarily fix broken logic, but just have it function the way we expect. But there is an actual bug that we have in the series due to the revival platform. So if I go into my code and I'm going to go to my SSB template character, I have this exit revival platform function, which basically means if I am in a state, right, where I can exit the revival platform, then we're going to destroy the revival platform and put the state to idle. Now, the thing with that is what we were doing is we were waiting to see if when the platform was coming down, if an input came in, we would set the state to be idle, and we would basically get them out of the respawning state. That's okay in a way, but the problem is when we were doing this, this was actually, we didn't have this part in here. I've added this for today's episode. We didn't have that part in here. So what was actually happening is we were just basically having our character state set to idle constantly when we pressed any key, because our exit revival platform, if we go to our project input settings and look at our action mappings, we have these exit revival platforms and they're bound to any key. So literally anytime we pressed any key, it called this function, and if we could move and this cast succeeded, it would destroy revival platform if it existed, and then would set the character state to idle. So this was actually overriding a lot of our character states for our movement and our throws, and sometimes we would not be able to throw properly. Now, I've added this additional check, if the character state is equal to respawning. I'll go as far as to even say, or character state equals idle. We can go ahead and call this function. There you go. So this is what exit revival platform should look like, because what's going to happen is when we play the game, this can get called every time we press any key, and that's fine, but we have to make sure that we're in a state or a condition to even do this logic. And these are the only two states you can be in while the revival platform exists: respawning or idle. Respawning is when we are coming down from the sky, and idle is when we're sitting on the revival platform if you intentionally delay coming off of it, because you can choose if you jump off of it sooner or later. So we can be in either respawning or idle, and these times we may want to go ahead and do this logic. At that point, there's really no reason to set it to idle if we're in idle, but my point is we need to stop this logic from occurring no matter what state we're in. That way we can always throw our weapon. We don't get that bug where we can't throw it. Make sure that you actually make this the name of your enum, like e-idle, not just idle. There's a typo on my part. When you play your game, you'll be able to always throw your weapon. You'll never run into that issue again unless there's an issue elsewhere. See, no matter how many times I do it, I can always throw my weapon. Perfect. With that stuff out of the way, we can get into the other content for today that's going to clean up our project quite a bit. So first things first, let's get into our base item BP and let's look at a few things. Okay. So let's go to our event throw item and I'll show you what has changed. Now, sometimes our weapon, our sword BP, whatever that we're throwing, would hit an object and kind of stop in the air. And it doesn't hit a character, which is kind of weird because you're like, well, the only cast we ever do for the collision of the collider on the weapon is against the character. So we're not manually stopping the projectile when it collides with something. However, a projectile movement component will not try and go through something that has collision. So if we collide with an object, the projectile still acts as it should, saying, oh, I hit this object that has collision that is blocking against me or overlapping against me. So I have to relay that back to the blueprint to know what I've hit. In this case, if we have a blocking object that we hit, it's going to stop. So for example, if we were to throw this and it hits the ground, see I'm low and the rotating hits the ground? Like this. It hits the ground, you can see it's rotating. That's because it collided with the ground, but it didn't collide with a character. Since it collided with the ground, it's going to rotate in place. So we can fix that, and we're going to fix that, but we're going to wait for the gravity episode on that, because we need collisions to work with the ground and one-way platforms and potentially other stage things without doing that behavior that they're doing. One thing we can do is make it so when the object is thrown, it kind of ignores some certain actors. So for example, when we throw this, if we do it just right, okay, I have to be careful I don't hit the ground, but I can also hit the one-way platform like that. You saw how the sword clearly interacted with the one-way platform, but it went through it. Well, we want collision on the one-way platform like we've had, but when we're throwing it, we probably don't care if it hits it like that. Maybe you do. I don't, because a lot of these one-way platforms are really thin. You're going to have platforms in the stage that you don't necessarily want to interact with it. You want to ignore it. That's up to you. You could always allow the collision to occur, but I think it's smoother if it can overlap with these one-way platforms when we throw it. So we can actually just change the collision channels for an object that is being thrown very easily. So, for example, throw it, and see, it just goes through the one-way platforms until it hits my character or goes off the stage. Now, if it were to hit a wall or whatever, it would still do the same logic that we expect, where it would stop in its tracks. But what I'd recommend doing is on the static mesh itself in the base item BP, if we scroll down to the collision, one-way platform was a block by default. You can leave it as either block or overlap. It doesn't matter by default because we're going to change it when we throw it. I actually made it overlap by default because these things are going to spawn from the sky instead of just spawn on the ground like they're doing now. And they're going to drop into the stage like you see in Super Smash Brothers. Because of that, we're going to apply gravity to it immediately after spawning, and we'll set the collision settings in there. So what you have by default doesn't really matter, whether it's overlap or block. You're going to get the same result. So I'm going to put it back to block just to show you. Okay, you can leave it at block, and we don't want it to hit those platforms. Now, when we throw the item, what we have to do is make sure we set the collision response of the mesh to be overlap. We also, of course, have to then reset it when we drop the item or the item hits something that is a block. Okay? So, after the item's thrown, I grab my static mesh. I set collision response to channel. The channel I want is the one-way platform, since that's the one that we're referring to here, and I want to overlap with it. You could choose ignore as well, but if we do overlap, it makes it easier in the future if we ever have to place it at a certain spot. For example, say it collides with an enemy on the one-way platform. We may want to then launch the weapon up in the air and have it land on the one-way platform instead of being stuck between like halfway through the one-way platform at the top and at the bottom. So overlapping, we can still tell if there's a collision occurring, and we can potentially do different logic to make sure that the weapon does not get stuck there. So I'd recommend that, but that's a little bit for down the road. But either way, just make sure it's not block. An additional thing I did here is I took out the up and down rotation rates. When we throw it up and down, we will have a rotation rate, but it's going to be handled a little bit differently. We're going to have to be throwing it up and deciding what direction we want to rotate, and down what direction we want to rotate. We're probably going to have it different for left and right. But the thing with the rotating movement is it depends on the direction we're throwing it. So we put in -360 as the rotation rate, which happens to rotate it both right if we're facing right and left if we're facing left. That's because of where we attached it to the socket and where we released it. So for up and down, we're going to do it separately, but we'll cover that in the up and down episode. So I'm just showing you, I've disconnected it for up and down throws right now. So I just have left and right going into this one rotation setting. Okay. Now, if we throw the item and it collides with an opponent, we call stop projectile movement. If we drop an item, we call stop projectile movement. So, under either of those cases, what we want to do is figure out how we want to stop our movement and what we need to do then. What we had done previously is we stopped the actual movement of the projectile as well as stopped the rotation rate. Then we rotate it to the upright position. We have to now enable the one-way platform response to be block. Because at this point, and especially when we include gravity again, we're going to want to block the mesh. That way it can land on one-way platforms. Otherwise, when we play our game, we'll be able to come in here, say throw this. Gravity will be applied and it will fall directly straight through from where it just hit the opponent down to this stone on the ground here, because one-way platform has no collision with that sword anyway. So we don't want that. We don't want there to be no collision with the sword and the one-way platform. So we have to make sure we reset it to be block once the movement has stopped. Okay? So we set the collision response to the channel back to block. So it's basically the same nodes we did here, except the new response is block. Alright. Everything else in base item BP is actually good, so that's nothing to worry about. You don't have to change anything in there. But there are things in the children we need to change. Alright. So now what I would do is I would take a look at our base weapon BP. Remember, there's a difference between item and weapon. They're very similar, but item just means that it's something that can be spawned in the world and potentially picked up or thrown. It doesn't even have to be. I always use the example of the food item in Super Smash Brothers. You go up to it, it's on the ground, it's a healing item, so you interact with it and it basically just disappears and you heal yourself. Well, you can't pick it up and throw it. That's not how those work. Now, so if you have something that you can pick up and throw, I consider it a weapon. It doesn't necessarily have to be like a damaging weapon. Like, for example, it doesn't have to be a hammer or a sword. It could just be a trash bag, a Pokeball. It doesn't matter what it is. It could be literally anything, just as long as you can pick it up and then throw it. So that's the difference between item and weapon. In weapon, that's when we can grab things, so we need to be able to attach things to sockets. Well, in base weapon BP, we had this logic set up of what would happen when we use it, such as disabling collision on it and attaching it to our character. And then we were going into the actual, and we were attaching it. Now, this could be useful, being able to do things separately for every weapon, or every single item we can pick up. However, we want a way to make this a little bit more uniform, because we're considering all weapons can be picked up in one way or another, even if they're at different sockets, whatever. So, what I've done is, instead of having the logic in the sword weapon BP, we're going to move it to the base weapon BP. This will make our lives so much easier in the future. So in base weapon BP, we have attached weapon item, but it was actually empty. You may have even deleted it because we didn't fill it out. We actually want to have it in our base weapon here. So you can go ahead and, if you don't have the event in, I already have it in, but if you type it in, it'll come up here. It'll be the event. I just already have it, so I can't do it again. But once you get this event back in the base weapon BP, what we really want to do is do the logic in here, and then make it so the individual items and weapons don't actually do this logic unless they have to. Some weapons are going to be unique. Say this weapon's bigger than others, or it has to be held differently than others. It may need a totally different set of logic than just changing a socket name. Something that's not necessarily simple enough to put into the one function. So you can still do specific logic in the individual weapons. Okay, this is what we had in here before. All right, so for this guy right here, you can delete him now. We don't need to do it here. In fact, you'll probably want to copy it because we're going to paste it over in base weapon BP and make some adjustments. So I'd recommend copying these nodes from your individual items, pasting them in your base weapon BP. We'll come back to this in a second. All right, then once you've done that, you can delete these from your sword weapon BP. What we have to do is figure out the way to call the parent function. We can still do logic before this. Notice this. We can still have nodes in here. Okay? I can put a print string in here. And then I call the parent function attach weapon item, which is this guy here. So let's take a look at this before we continue. So the sword has an individual node to print string hello, and we still call the parent logic to then attach it. Let's say I drop the sword. These are technically items as well. They're not weapons, okay? So when I pick them up, you'll notice that nothing prints. Okay? If we had another weapon, we could pick it up and nothing would print, because that print is only in the sword weapon BP. So note that we're not losing access to this specific logic on the sword. Instead, we're just making sure that all of the logic that is shared between weapons can be done in the base weapon while still having unique logic in the child. Now, the way you get this parent node, it's not as easy as just looking for like attached weapon item. If you do this, you're just going to call the target of yourself. So this is just calling it on the sword. To get the parent, what you actually do is you grab the event in the blueprint, right click on it, and add call to parent function. When you do this, it makes it for you with all the parameters that the parent function has. So I directly passed the character reference of this one on the sword into the parent's character reference. Okay? Now, remember I said you have these nodes, and we're attaching the weapon, the mesh of the weapon, to the character mesh at the socket here. So basically, sword going into character's hand. I've made another change. The rotation rule was previously keep world, but really we want it to be snap to target now. It was keep world because we didn't have a specific spot to spawn it. We were just keeping the rotation that it was picked up on. We want to always have the characters hold them the same way. That's what we're fixing here. So to fix that and make them so they're always holding it as they should be, the sword should always be upright or in this pose when they're in this animation, we have to make sure it snaps to the target, which is our socket. So change it from keep world to snap to target. Okay? And then make sure you connect the attached weapon item to that. Alright. These nodes here will now allow you to always be consistent with where that weapon attaches. And since we fixed a lot of the rotational issues in the first episode, now it'll look good. You'll always have the sword upright. If you remember before, I was able to pick up the sword. In fact, I can show you. And what it'll look like is this. So we could pick up a sword, and depending on how we were walking, it might actually appear in different spots. Like that happened to look good. But you can see this. Well, the sword should not look like it's facing that way. I mean, you could have the sword facing that way, but why isn't it the same as the first time I picked it up? Okay? And like, what if I were to do this? See? So depending on what way I'm facing, depending on how the sword falls, I can pick these weapons up and they can be different. And we don't want that. So if you just go ahead and make sure you change this to snap to target, it fixes that issue. Now you'll always get it the exact same orientation. Okay. Okay. So we're perfect there. I have an additional thing here. This should rotate to upright. I'm setting to false when we attach the weapon. This is a good idea because there are times when for example, let's say we were able to catch a weapon. All right, say we throw it and someone else can catch it. This is actually possible depending on the weapon, depending on some other circumstances. At that point, we want to make sure, even if it hasn't collided, if it hasn't stopped the projectile movement, we don't want it to be trying to rotate anymore, or it will rotate in the character's hand, which looks weird. So it should rotate to upright. We just want to reset that at that point. We don't want to allow that to rotate anymore. It doesn't need to readjust. It just needs to attach to where the mesh is. This also allows us to make our performance a little bit better by not trying to fight the tick on base item BP, where we check for this. If should rotate to upright is false, we skip all this logic, and thus we don't have to worry about it. So all around, that's just a small change that makes our lives a lot easier and our performance better. Now, on top of that, what we should do is adjust our socket, because we want to make sure that our socket is displaying these weapons correctly. What I mean by that is you saw how the sword was upright when I picked it up. Well, you can rotate a socket. For me, it was actually facing downward when I first put the socket on. So sometimes the sword would look like it was appearing at the bottom as opposed to coming out of the top, like he's actually holding it. So what we can do is we can go into our skeleton. Should be able to find this, but just in case you have trouble or forget where you put it, I put mine in the animations folder under skeleton. and you just double click on it and go to the mesh or the skeleton here. You can use these buttons at the top to navigate. You have animations, mesh, skeleton, and this is the NMVP, and then this is the actual physics asset. What we want is the skeleton. So once you get here, you can find your socket again that we had. I called this one the melee weapon socket. You can call it sword socket if you want to be more specific, depending on your weapons that you have. And so this socket needs to be rotated, depending on how we want it to face. The character's hand is facing down. It's going to change based on where the animation is, but we always want the socket and where the weapon is to be the same in a relative fashion to the hand, to whatever's holding it. That way you don't get at these weird orientations or where it's like dragging across the ground or upside down. There's not a good way that I'm aware of to know what direction it's facing because the socket doesn't have like an arrow indicator. So you can kind of follow these axes here and determine which way it's facing, but it's honestly pretty complicated. So what I'd recommend doing is this. Okay. So I went into the game. I determined what I didn't like about my socket. For example, like I said, mine was like pointed down, and I said I want it coming out of the player's hand. So I clicked on the socket. I clicked the rotation button here, and then I just moved it flat out. So say I move it here and I save this. When I go to play the game, it's going to be a little bit different than the previous time. So now it's not quite the same. All right. And I'm like, maybe that's not good. So I can rotate it some more. Save it. And I come in here. And now it's facing down here. Well, that's not what I want, is it? So you can see I can just modify it and test it every time. I'm going to undo so it's back where I like it. Alternatively, though, you can actually just attach a preview asset. So I don't necessarily have anything called sword. Instead, what I actually use is the mesh that's on my sword. So if I look at this, I use an SM pillar frame. What I can do is add a preview asset of SM pillar frame. And now I can see where it's going to be at that socket. Now it's huge and it's scaled down on the base weapon BP, but still you get the idea. So now when I rotate this socket, you can see where it's going to show up. Okay, so you can use this to get it just right. I'm going to undo it so I get it back to where I like it, but there you go. You can use these sockets and kind of test out where things will be. If you want to delete it, you can't just right click on it and delete it. It's a little bit weird, but you can right click on the socket and do remove all attached assets. That'll keep the socket in place and remove any preview assets attached to it. Then just save it, play your game. Make sure it looks like how you saw your socket and your preview asset in there, and you'll be good to go. You can always have your items attached at this specific point at that orientation. And honestly, guys, that's all I got. So thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed and this helped you with some of your item physics, and if you're excited for more, please subscribe. It does more for myself in the series than anything else you can do. I really appreciate it. I want to give a massive shout out to my YouTube membership and Patreon supporters and subscribers. Thank you guys for everything. These series, I love working on so much, and the fact that you guys are so excited to see more, and you give me all these ideas of what to work on next. I really appreciate it. I'm so grateful. Thank you so much. If you had any issues with this tutorial, or any of my tutorials, feel free to join the Discord community. I'd be happy to get you sorted, and it's completely free. Anyway, guys, like I said, that's all I got, so thank you so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.